The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as Admiral Theodore Blackwood's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Before any of you say another word about my daughter-in-law, you should know something. She outranks us all. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft clink of a wine glass being set down with trembling hands. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 months earlier, I stood in the cramped bathroom of the Greyhound station in Richmond, Virginia, staring at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My hands shook as I applied the last of my drugstore lipstick, trying to look presentable for what would be the most important dinner of my life. In 6 hours, I would meet Marcus Blackwood's family for the first time. Marcus had warned me they were traditional, but nothing could have prepared me for what that really meant. Growing up in a trailer park in eastern Kentucky, I knew the weight that certain last names carried in some circles. The Blackwoods weren't just any military family. They were American naval royalty with a lineage of service dating back to the Revolutionary War. I had met Marcus at a community college in Norfolk, where I was finishing my nursing degree on a patchwork of scholarships, grants, and 3 part-time jobs. He was there taking prerequisite courses before applying to the Naval Academy's graduate program. Most people assumed someone like him, tall, confident, with that easy smile that came from never doubting your place in the world, wouldn't give someone like me a second glance. But Marcus was different. He didn't care that I bought my textbooks secondhand, or that my work uniform from the all-night diner still smelled like bacon grease when we studied together in the library. When I told him I'd been accepted to the accelerated nursing program at Johns Hopkins but couldn't afford it, he didn't offer money or pity. Instead, he spent hours helping me research grants and military nursing programs I'd never heard of. The first time he mentioned taking me home to meet his family, my stomach dropped. "They're going to love you, Sarah," he said, reaching across the table at our usual coffee shop. My mom's been dying to meet the woman who finally got me to settle down. But as we drove through the wrought iron gates of the Blackwood estate in Williamsburg, I felt like I was entering another world entirely. The colonial mansion sat on perfectly manicured grounds, complete with a circular driveway and white columns that seemed to stretch up to the clouds. Cars that cost more than I'd make in 5 years lined the drive: Mercedes, BMW, a vintage Jaguar that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Marcus squeezed my hand as we walked to the front door. "Remember, they're just people, Sarah. Flawed, complicated people like everyone else." The door opened before we could knock, revealing a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Southern Living magazine. Patricia Blackwood had silver hair swept into an elegant chignon and wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was polite but didn't reach her eyes as she looked me up and down, taking in my Target dress and discount store shoes. "Marcus, darling!" She embraced her son warmly before turning to me with considerably less enthusiasm. "And you must be Sarah. We've heard so much about you." The way she said so much made it clear that what she'd heard hadn't impressed her. The living room was filled with Marcus's relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, all impeccably dressed and speaking in the kind of refined tones that come from generations of private school education. I recognized some of the names from Marcus's stories. His uncle Richard, a federal judge, his cousin Amanda, who worked for the State Department, his brother Jonathan, fresh out of Harvard Law. The conversation flowed around topics I had no reference point for: summer homes in the Hamptons, country club politics, mutual acquaintances from exclusive boarding schools. I tried to contribute where I could, but my attempts were met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. "So Sarah," Amanda said during a lull in conversation, her tones syrupy sweet, "Marcus tells us you're in school. Where did you do your undergraduate work?" "I actually went straight to nursing school after high school," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Community college first, then transferred to complete my RN." The silence that followed was brief but telling. "How practical," Patricia said finally. "It's wonderful that young people today have so many different paths available to them." The word "different" hung in the air like smoke. Jonathan leaned forward with a condescending smile. "And where exactly are you from, Sarah? Your accent is charming." "Eastern Kentucky," I said, lifting my chin slightly. "A small town called Paintsville." Oh, Richard said, as if that explained everything. Coal country. The conversation moved on, but I caught the exchanged glances, the barely suppressed smirks. When dinner was announced, I found myself seated between Marcus's elderly great-aunt Millicent and his teenage cousin Blake, clearly the kids' table equivalent in this sophisticated gathering. Throughout the meal, the family shared stories about Marcus's childhood, sailing lessons at the yacht club, family trips to Europe, Christmas mornings with mountains of expensive gifts. Each anecdote felt like a gentle reminder of how different our backgrounds were. Remember when Marcus was 12 and tried to sail to Bermuda by himself? Jonathan laughed. Dad was so furious he grounded him from the yacht for a whole month. Everyone chuckled at the memory of a childhood punishment that involved being banned from a yacht. I thought about being 12 and babysitting my younger siblings while my mother worked double shifts at the factory. What about you, Sarah? Millicent asked suddenly. What was your favorite childhood vacation? The question caught me off guard. We didn't really travel much when I was growing up, I said carefully. But we used to camp sometimes at the state park near our house. I loved those trips. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Patricia smoothly changed the subject to the upcoming charity gala at the country club. As dessert was served, some elaborate French confection that I couldn't pronounce, Amanda turned to me with what she probably thought was a friendly smile. It must be so exciting for you, experiencing all of this. I imagine it's quite different from what you're used to. There it was again, that emphasis on different, as if I were some exotic creature they were observing for their amusement. Everything's an adjustment, I replied diplomatically, but inside I was seething. These people didn't know anything about me beyond my zip code and my accent, yet they'd already decided I didn't belong. The final blow came as we were preparing to leave. Patricia pulled Marcus aside in the foyer while I waited by the door, but her voice carried clearly in the spacious entryway. She seems like a lovely girl, darling, but are you sure about this? You have so much potential, so many opportunities ahead of you. Don't you think you should be with someone who can really understand your world? Someone who can be a true partner in the life you're meant to live. Marcus's response was firm but quiet, and I couldn't make out his words. But the damage was done. As we drove away from the estate in silence, I stared out the window at the manicured neighborhoods full of houses, where I would never truly belong. They just need time to get to know you, Marcus said finally, reaching for my hand. But I knew better. In their eyes, I would always be the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who had somehow convinced their golden boy to lower his standards. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to find out, was that beneath my humble background lay something that would soon turn their entire world upside down. 6 me. The weeks following that disastrous dinner felt like walking through a minefield. Marcus tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could see the strain in his eyes every time his phone buzzed with messages from his family. He'd started taking calls in the other room, speaking in hushed tones that told me everything I needed to know about the content of those conversations. The wedding planning became a battleground disguised as helpful suggestions. Patricia called daily with ideas that were really thinly veiled attempts to control every aspect of our ceremony. She insisted on using the family's wedding planner, a woman named Vivian Ashworth, who treated me like an unfortunate obstacle to overcome rather than the bride. Now, dear, Vivian said during our first meeting at her downtown Richmond office, Mrs. Blackwood has shown me some beautiful venues. The Jefferson Hotel Ballroom would be perfect. Or perhaps the Country Club of Virginia. Very traditional, very elegant. I glanced at the price sheets she slid across the mahogany table. The cheapest option would cost more than my father made in 3 years. We were actually thinking of something smaller, I said carefully. Maybe the community center, where Marcus and I first met? Vivian's perfectly penciled eyebrows shot up as if I'd suggested holding the ceremony in a barn. Oh my. Well, I suppose we could work with that, but you'd need extensive decorating to make it suitable. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table. We'd already discussed keeping the wedding simple, something we could actually afford without going into debt for the next decade. But it became clear that simple wasn't in the Blackwood vocabulary. The guest list became another source of tension. Patricia sent over a list of essential family friends and naval colleagues, who simply had to be invited. The list contained over 200 names, People I'd never met who would judge every detail of our wedding while wondering what Marcus was thinking. "We can't invite all these people," I told Marcus one evening, as we sat in his tiny apartment near the base. "The venue won't hold half of them, and even if it could, we can't afford to feed an army." "I know," he said, running his hands through his hair. "Let me talk to my mother again." But when he did, Patricia's response was swift and cutting. She called me directly, her voice crisp with barely contained frustration. "Sarah, darling, I understand this is all overwhelming for you, but you have to understand our position. The Blackwood name carries certain expectations. We have obligations to people who have been part of our lives for generations. Surely you can see how this reflects on Marcus's future career. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off." The implication was clear. My small-town sensibilities were already damaging Marcus's prospects. The final straw came at the bridal shower Patricia insisted on hosting. I'd begged her to keep it small, just immediate family, but when I walked into the private dining room at her country club, I found myself facing 30 women I'd never met, all impeccably dressed and wearing the kind of polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The gifts were beautiful and expensive: crystal stemware, silver serving pieces, designer linens that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. With each present I unwrapped, the comments grew more pointed. "Oh, how lovely," said one of Patricia's friends as I held up an elaborate silver tea service. "Do you know how to properly care for silver, dear? It requires special attention." Another woman leaned forward with mock concern. "I hope you won't be working after the wedding. It's so important for a naval officer's wife to be available for social obligations. The Wives Club keeps us quite busy." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "Actually, I'll be starting my position at Norfolk General Hospital next month. It's a wonderful opportunity in their trauma unit." The silence that followed was deafening. These women couldn't fathom why anyone would choose to work when they didn't have to, especially in something as unglamorous as nursing. "How ambitious," Patricia said finally, her tone suggesting ambition was something slightly unseemly. The conversation shifted to topics I had no hope of contributing to: mutual acquaintances from exclusive social circles, charity committees I'd never heard of, vacation destinations that required passports I'd never owned. I sat there feeling increasingly invisible, like a ghost haunting someone else's life. But it was Amanda who delivered the killing blow. As the party was winding down and I was thanking everyone for coming, she pulled me aside near the coat check. "You know, Sarah, I really admire what you're trying to do," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "It must be so hard, trying to fit into a world you don't understand. But I have to ask, don't you worry that you're holding Marcus back? He could have anyone, someone from his own background, someone who understands the demands of military life, someone who could actually help his career instead of—" She gestured vaguely at me. "Well, instead of being a liability." The word liability hit me like a physical blow. For a moment I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, then something cold and hard settled in my chest. "I appreciate your concern," I said quietly, "but Marcus is perfectly capable of making his own decisions about what's best for his future." Amanda's smile turned predatory. "Of course he is, but sometimes love blinds us to practical realities. I'm sure you understand." That night, I sat in my tiny studio apartment staring at the engagement ring on my finger. It was beautiful but modest. Marcus had insisted on buying something we could actually afford, rather than going into debt for a rock that would impress his family. Now I wondered if that had been a mistake, if everything about me was a mistake. The self-doubt ate at me like acid. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was holding Marcus back. Maybe love wasn't enough to bridge the gap between our worlds. Maybe I was being selfish, tying him to someone who would always be an embarrassment to his family and a hindrance to his career. When Marcus stopped by the next evening, he found me packing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his face going pale as he saw the boxes scattered around my apartment. "I think your family is right," I said without looking at him. "We're too different. I'm not what you need." He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed my hands, stopping me from folding another sweater. "Sarah, look at me. Whatever they said to you, whatever they did—" "They didn't do anything," I interrupted. "They don't have to. I can see it in their eyes every time they look at me. I'm the girl who doesn't belong, and I never will. I don't care what they think, Marcus said fiercely. I care about you. I love you. But they're your family, I whispered. And every family gathering, every military function, every important moment in your career, I'll be there dragging you down. They'll always be waiting for you to come to your senses. Marcus pulled me into his arms, and I felt some of my resolve crumble. What if I told you that you're wrong about everything? What if I told you that my family doesn't know the first thing about what really matters? It doesn't change the facts, I said against his chest. I'm a nobody from nowhere, and you're American naval royalty. He pulled back to look at me, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not just love, but something that looked almost like anticipation. There's something I need to tell you, he said slowly. Something about why I fell in love with you in the first place. Something about who you really are that my family doesn't know yet. Before I could ask what he meant, his phone rang. The caller ID showed, Dad, and Marcus's expression grew serious as he answered. Yes, sir. Tomorrow? But the dinner isn't until… His face changed as he listened. I understand. Yes, sir. We'll be there. He hung up and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. That was my father. He's coming home early from deployment. He wants to meet you tomorrow, before the family dinner, just the three of us. Admiral Theodore Blackwood. The man whose very name made seasoned naval officers stand a little straighter. The patriarch of the family, whose approval or disapproval could shape Marcus's entire future. Marcus, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending I belong in your world. But even as I said the words, something in Marcus's expression told me that tomorrow would change everything, one way or another. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of Marcus's apartment as I sat on his couch, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Neither of us had slept much after his father's unexpected call. The Admiral was arriving at Norfolk Naval Base at 0800 hours and wanted to meet me at 1100, military precision that left no room for delay or excuses. Tell me about him, I said, breaking the silence that had stretched between us for the better part of an hour. Marcus looked up from where he'd been pacing near the window, still in yesterday's clothes. My father, he's complicated, fair, but demanding. He doesn't waste words or time on pleasantries. That's not what I meant. I set down my mug and studied his face. You said something last night about who I really am. About something your family doesn't know. What did you mean? For a moment, something flickered across Marcus's features. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. I should have told you sooner. I should have told all of them sooner. But I wanted to protect you from exactly what happened yesterday. Protect me from what? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with a text. His face went pale as he read it. He's early. Dad wants to meet in 30 minutes at the base. Sarah, there's something you need to know before we go. Something about your family history that you might not be aware of. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? My family history? Marcus sat down beside me, taking my hands in his. Do you remember telling me about your grandfather? The one who died when you were little? Charles Mitchell? Of course. Grandpa Charlie died when I was 7. He was in the army during Vietnam. The memory of a gentle man who always smelled like pipe tobacco and told the best bedtime stories brought a familiar ache to my chest. Sarah, your grandfather wasn't just in the army, he was in the Special Forces, Green Beret, and after Vietnam he did something that very few people know about. Marcus's voice was gentle but serious. When I started getting serious about you, I wanted to know everything about your family. Not because I doubted you, but because I love you. So I did some research. What kind of research? My voice was barely above a whisper. Military records. My father has access to files that most people never see. Sarah, your grandfather received the Medal of Honor. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. My grandmother never mentioned anything like that. Neither did my mother. That's because it was classified for 47 years. The mission he led in Cambodia in 1971. It was so sensitive that all records were sealed. The families weren't even told about the medals. They were only declassified last year. I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. You're telling me my grandfather was a war hero, and nobody in my family knew? Not just a war hero, Sarah. One of the most decorated soldiers of his generation. The mission he led saved 3 villages from being overrun. He pulled 17 wounded soldiers to safety under heavy fire, then held off an entire enemy platoon for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. The citation for his Medal of Honor reads like something out of a movie. My mind reeled. Grandpa Charlie, who had spent his later years working at a small-town hardware store, who had never talked about the war except to say it was a long time ago and best forgotten, had been a genuine American hero. There's more, Marcus continued. After the war, he was recruited by the CIA for operations that are still classified. He turned them down because he wanted to come home to his family, your grandmother, your mother. Why didn't anyone tell us? I asked, tears starting to form in my eyes. Because he asked them not to. According to the files, he said he wanted to be remembered as a grandfather and a husband, not as a soldier. He made them promise that his family would never be bothered by his military record. I thought about all the times my family had been looked down upon, all the assumptions people had made about us based on our address and our accents. All this time we had carried the blood of someone who had embodied the very best of American military service. Marcus, why are you telling me this now? His expression grew serious. Because my father knows. He's known since the records were declassified. And Sarah, in the military world, particularly in naval circles where my family moves, the Medal of Honor is the highest possible honor. It transcends rank, social status, everything. Your grandfather's service record commands respect from every military officer in the country, including my father. The drive to Norfolk Naval Base passed in a blur. I kept thinking about Grandpa Charlie, trying to reconcile the quiet man I remembered with the hero Marcus had described. As we approached the base gates, my stomach churned with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Admiral Theodore Blackwood's office was exactly what I'd expected. Pristine, efficient, with commendations and photographs covering every wall. The man himself was more imposing in person than in the family photos I'd seen. Tall and silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that commanded attention even in civilian clothes. Sarah, he said, rising from behind his desk as we entered. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Thank you for making time to meet with me, Admiral, I replied, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. He gestured for us to sit in the chairs arranged in front of his desk. For a moment, the 3 of us sat in silence, and I could feel the weight of his assessment. Marcus tells me you're a nurse, he said finally. Yes, sir. I start at Norfolk General next month in their trauma unit. Trauma nursing. Demanding work. High stress, life and death decisions. His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. What drew you to that specialty? I suppose I wanted to help people when they needed it most. My grandfather always said that how you act in a crisis shows who you really are. Something shifted in the Admiral's expression at the mention of my grandfather. Tell me about him. I glanced at Marcus, unsure how much to reveal. He was the strongest person I knew. He never talked much about Vietnam, but he taught me about service. About doing what's right, even when it's hard. Admiral Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying me with new intensity. Charles Mitchell. It wasn't a question. My heart stopped. You know about my grandfather? I know about Sergeant First Class Charles Mitchell, Medal of Honor recipient, Army Special Forces. I know about Operation Phoenix Dawn, though most of the details remain classified even today. The Admiral's voice carried a weight of respect I'd never heard before. I also know that he was offered a direct commission to officer rank 3 different times and turned it down each time because he preferred to serve with enlisted men. Tears started flowing down my cheeks. I never knew, my family never knew. He didn't want you to know, but I think it's time you understood something, Sarah. Admiral Blackwood stood and walked to a cabinet behind his desk, pulling out a thick folder. Your grandfather saved my life. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. What? Cambodia, 1971. I was a young lieutenant, fresh out of Annapolis, convinced I knew everything about leadership and warfare. I led my team into an ambush that should have killed us all. He opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photograph of young soldiers. Your grandfather wasn't even part of our mission. He was passing through with his own team when he heard the firefight. He could have kept moving, probably should have, given his orders. Instead, he turned around and came back for us. He pointed to a young man in the photograph who I could barely recognize as the Admiral sitting before me. That's me, unconscious with shrapnel in my chest. And that's your grandfather, carrying me to the extraction point while taking fire from 3 directions. I stared at the photograph, seeing my grandfather's familiar face for the first time in military context. Even in the grainy black and white image, his determination was unmistakable. Every day for the past 50 years, I've known that I owe my life to Charles Mitchell. Every promotion I've received, every command I've held, every moment I've spent with my family, all of it exists because of his courage. The Admiral's voice grew thick with emotion. When Marcus told me he was dating someone named Sarah Mitchell from eastern Kentucky, I had to investigate. When I discovered you were Charlie's granddaughter, he paused, collecting himself. Well, let's just say that changes everything. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet, like everything I thought I knew about my place in the world had been turned upside down. Admiral, I said finally, your family doesn't see it that way. To them, I'm just a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who's not good enough for Marcus. His expression hardened. My family doesn't know what I know, but they're about to learn. The 3 hours between leaving Admiral Blackwood's office and arriving at the family dinner felt like the longest of my life. I sat in Marcus's apartment, still processing everything I'd learned about my grandfather, while Marcus paced nervously around the room. My father wants to handle this his way, Marcus said for the 3rd time, checking his watch. He asked us not to say anything until he's ready. I touched the small jewelry box the Admiral had pressed into my hands before we left his office. Inside was my grandfather's Medal of Honor, the one the military had kept in their files for nearly 50 years. Admiral Blackwood had somehow arranged for it to be released to the family, and he'd insisted I should be the one to carry it. Sarah, you need to understand something, he had said as he handed me the box. What happens tonight isn't just about you and Marcus. It's about honor, legacy, and respect. Your grandfather taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right despite the fear. Now, as I slipped into the one dressy outfit I owned that hadn't been scrutinized and found wanting by the Blackwood women, I tried to channel whatever strength Grandpa Charlie had passed down to me. The drive to the family estate felt different this time. Marcus was quieter, more focused, and there was an energy in the car that hadn't been there before. As we pulled through the wrought iron gates, I noticed additional cars in the driveway. More family members had arrived for what Patricia had described as a proper welcome dinner for the Admiral's return. But when we walked through the front door, the atmosphere was immediately tense. Patricia stood in the foyer wearing an expression that could have frozen fire, and Amanda lurked nearby with a look of barely contained smugness. Marcus, darling, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Your father called ahead. He wants everyone assembled in the formal dining room immediately. No cocktails, no socializing, very unlike him. Where is Dad? Marcus asked. In his study, making phone calls. He's been locked in there since he arrived. Patricia's eyes flicked to me with obvious irritation. I assume this sudden change in protocol has something to do with recent developments. The formal dining room held about 20 family members, all looking confused and slightly annoyed at being summoned without explanation. I recognized most of them from previous encounters. The same faces that had looked at me with varying degrees of disdain and pity over the past few months. Uncle Richard stood near the fireplace, his federal judge making him look like he was about to call the court to session. Jonathan and Amanda whispered together by the windows, shooting occasional glances in my direction. The elderly aunts sat together on the antique settee, their pearls gleaming under the chandelier as they murmured about the unusual circumstances. I don't understand why Father insisted on such formality, Jonathan said to no one in particular. It's just a family dinner. Perhaps he wants to discuss Marcus's engagement, Amanda suggested with false innocence. There have been some concerns raised about compatibility. The room fell silent, and every eye turned to me. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but before I could respond, the heavy oak doors opened, and Admiral Blackwood entered. He was in full dress uniform, his chest heavy with ribbons and commendations that represented decades of distinguished service. The transformation from the man in civilian clothes I'd met that morning was striking. This was Admiral Theodore Blackwood in all his official authority, and the room immediately snapped to attention. "Please, everyone be seated," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. The family arranged themselves around the massive dining table, with the Admiral taking his traditional place at the head. Marcus and I were seated to his right, while Patricia sat to his left, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I've called you all here tonight because there's something that needs to be addressed," the Admiral began, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's come to my attention that some members of this family have expressed reservations about Marcus's choice of bride." The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Patricia's face flushed slightly. "Theodore," Patricia began carefully, "we've only expressed concern for Marcus's future." Concern. The Admiral's voice cut through her words like a blade. Based on what, exactly? Miss Mitchell's educational background? Her family's economic status? Her geographic origins? Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "Theodore, we all want what's best for Marcus. His career, his social standing." "His social standing." The Admiral repeated the words with obvious distaste. "Tell me, Richard, what do you know about social standing? About true honor?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard looked confused, glancing around the table for support that didn't come. "I think perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Patricia said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when trying to smooth over uncomfortable situations. "We all think Sarah is a lovely girl. It's just that Marcus has so many opportunities, so many connections that could benefit his career." Connections. Admiral Blackwood stood, his uniform making him appear even more imposing. "Let me tell you about connections. About honor. About the kind of family legacy that actually matters." He walked to the sideboard and picked up a folder I hadn't noticed before. 2 months ago, military records that had been classified for nearly 50 years were finally released. Records that tell the story of one of the most courageous acts of heroism in American military history. The room was completely silent now, every family member hanging on his words. Cambodia, April 15, 1971. A young Army sergeant led a mission to extract civilians from a village under siege. When they encountered an enemy force 3 times their size, this sergeant could have retreated. Instead, he chose to stay and fight. He opened the folder and pulled out the same photograph he'd shown me that morning. This sergeant spent 6 hours under heavy enemy fire, pulling wounded soldiers to safety one by one. When his ammunition ran low, he used captured weapons. When those ran out, he fought hand to hand. By the time reinforcements arrived, he had saved 17 American lives and protected over 200 civilians. Amanda leaned forward, clearly not understanding why they were hearing about some random soldier from Vietnam. This man was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, the highest recognition our nation can bestow. But because the mission was classified, the award was kept secret from everyone, including his family. Admiral Blackwood's voice grew softer, more personal. That sergeant also saved the life of a young Navy lieutenant who had led his team into an ambush through inexperience and arrogance. A lieutenant who would have died in that jungle if not for the courage and skill of one extraordinary soldier. I saw the moment when understanding began to dawn on some of the family members' faces. That lieutenant was me, and that sergeant, Sergeant First Class Charles Mitchell, was Sarah's grandfather. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face had gone completely white, while Amanda's mouth hung open in shock. Jonathan looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Every day of my life since April 15, 1971, has been a gift from Charles Mitchell," the Admiral continued. "Every promotion, every command, every moment I've spent with my family, including all of you, exists because of his sacrifice." He moved to stand behind my chair, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "When I discovered that Marcus intended to marry Charles Mitchell's granddaughter, my first feeling was gratitude. Gratitude that I might have the opportunity to repay, in some small way, the debt I owe to her family." Uncle Richard was the first to find his voice. "Theodore, we had no idea." "No, you didn't." The Admiral's tone was sharp, Because you were too busy judging this young woman based on superficial criteria to bother learning who she really is. Too busy protecting your own sense of social superiority to recognize true nobility when it was sitting at your table. He walked back to the head of the table, his dress uniform gleaming under the chandelier light. Let me be absolutely clear about something. In the military, the Medal of Honor transcends all rank, all social distinctions, all petty concerns about background or breeding. When someone carries that legacy, they outrank everyone. The Admiral's eyes swept the room, making contact with each family member in turn. Sarah Mitchell carries the blood of one of the finest soldiers I've ever known, a man who embodied everything we claim to value as Americans: courage, selflessness, honor. And you? His voice carried a weight of disappointment that seemed to physically press down on the room. You've treated her like she wasn't worthy to breathe the same air. Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. Theodore, if we had known… If you had known? What? You would have treated her with basic human decency? You would have given her the respect that every person deserves, regardless of their grandfather's service record? The Admiral shook his head. That says everything I need to know about your character. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the full weight of the Admiral's words settled over them. I felt tears streaming down my face, not from sadness, but from a profound sense of vindication, not just for myself, but for my grandfather's memory. There's one more thing, the Admiral said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the small jewelry box I'd returned to him before dinner and set it gently on the table in front of me. This belongs to you, Sarah. It's been waiting 50 years to come home. With trembling fingers, I opened the small jewelry box. Inside, nestled in faded blue velvet, lay my grandfather's Medal of Honor. The bronze star gleamed under the chandelier light, its ribbon showing the distinctive blue field with 13 white stars. I had never seen one in person before, but I understood instinctively the weight of what I was holding, not just the physical medal, but everything it represented. Charles Mitchell earned this on April 15, 1971, Admiral Blackwood said, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for the sacred. But more than that, he lived it every day afterward. Sarah, your grandfather could have parlayed his service record into wealth, political connections, social status. Instead, he chose to go home to Kentucky, marry his sweetheart, raise his family, and work in a hardware store because that's what made him happy. I thought about Grandpa Charlie teaching me to fish at the creek behind our trailer, his patient hands showing me how to tie flies, his gentle voice explaining that the best things in life couldn't be bought. All this time, I thought I understood what he meant, but now I realize the profound truth behind his words. He never wanted recognition, I whispered, more to myself than to the room. He used to say that real heroes don't need parades. No, they don't, the Admiral agreed. But their families deserve respect. And their granddaughters shouldn't have to endure condescension from people who've never risked anything more dangerous than a bad stock pick. The insult hit its target. Uncle Richard's face flushed red, while Jonathan looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. But it was Patricia who seemed most shaken by the revelation. Her usual composure had completely cracked, leaving behind a woman who clearly understood that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Sarah, she said, her voice breaking slightly, I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, I replied quietly, standing up from my chair. The medal felt heavy in my hands, but not burdensome. It felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to. You've said enough over the past few months. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sarah, you have to understand our position. We didn't know. Your position? I turned to face her, and for the first time since I'd met this family, I felt no intimidation, no desire to shrink back or apologize for taking up space. Your position was that I wasn't good enough for Marcus because I didn't grow up with money, because I worked for everything I had, because my accent didn't match yours. That's not, Amanda started to protest. That's exactly what it was, I cut her off. You looked at me and saw someone beneath you. Someone you could dismiss and diminish because my family wasn't listed in the social register. Well, let me tell you something about my family. I walked around the table, the medal still clutched in my hands, feeling my grandfather's courage flowing through me like electricity. My family knows what it means to sacrifice. My grandmother worked 3 jobs to put my mother through nursing school, while my grandfather dealt with nightmares he never talked about. My mother raised 4 children while working double shifts at the county hospital, saving every penny so we could have opportunities she never had. We didn't have yacht clubs or country clubs, but we had something your family seems to have forgotten. We had honor. The room was completely silent. Even the servants who had been quietly setting up dinner service had stopped to listen. I'm a trauma nurse, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Do you know what that means? It means that when someone's child is dying on my table, they don't care where I went to school or what my father did for a living. They care that I can save their baby's life. They care that I won't give up, no matter how bad it gets. Because that's what my grandfather taught me. You don't quit when people are counting on you. I turned back to Patricia, who was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin. You worried that I would be a liability to Marcus's career? Let me tell you what a real liability looks like. It looks like a family so concerned with appearances that they've forgotten what actual honor means. It looks like people are so focused on status that they can't recognize character when it's sitting across from them at dinner. Marcus stood and moved to my side, his hand finding mine. Sarah? No, let me finish, I said, though my voice was gentler now. I want you all to understand something. I never wanted your money or your connections. I fell in love with Marcus because he's nothing like the rest of you. He sees people for who they are, not where they come from. He values kindness over pedigree, integrity over influence. I looked around the table one more time, meeting each pair of eyes that had once looked at me with such dismissal. My grandfather saved Admiral Blackwood's life because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. And 50 years later, Admiral Blackwood honored that sacrifice by standing up for his granddaughter when his own family wouldn't. That's what honor looks like. That's what the character looks like. The silence stretched on until Uncle Richard finally cleared his throat. Sarah, I owe you an apology. We all do. There's no excuse for how we've treated you. You're right, I said simply. There isn't. Jonathan shifted in his seat. Is there anything we can do to make this right? I considered his question carefully. You can start by treating people with basic human decency, regardless of their bank account or their zip code. You can stop assuming that wealth equals worth, or that education only counts if it comes from the right schools. And, Admiral Blackwood added from his position at the head of the table, you can remember that this family's reputation doesn't come from money or social connections. It comes from service. And Sarah understands service better than any of you. Patricia stood slowly, her composure finally returning. Sarah, I want you to know that from this moment forward, you will be treated as the honored member of this family that you should have been from the beginning. I'm ashamed of how we've behaved. I appreciate that, I said, but I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying Marcus to become part of your social circle. I'm marrying him because I love him. And if you can't accept me for who I am, a nurse from Kentucky, whose grandfather happened to be a war hero, then that's your loss, not mine. Amanda stood as well, her face flushed with what looked like genuine shame. Sarah, I said some terrible things to you. I let my own insecurities and prejudices cloud my judgment. You have every right to hate me. I don't hate you, I replied truthfully, but I don't trust you either. Trust has to be earned. The Admiral moved to stand beside me, his presence both protective and approving. Sarah's grandfather once told me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing not to let someone else's failures define your future. I think Charlie would be proud of the woman his granddaughter has become. As if on cue, the dinner bell chimed from the kitchen. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. We were still supposed to sit down together and share a meal after everything that had just transpired. I think, the Admiral said with a slight smile, we should eat, but first there's one more thing that needs to be said. He turned to address the entire room, his voice taking on the formal tone of command. Let me be absolutely clear about something. Sarah Mitchell will be my daughter-in-law, and she will be treated with the respect and honor due to the granddaughter of Medal of Honor recipient Charles Mitchell. Anyone who has a problem with that can remove themselves from this family's gatherings permanently. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was an order from a man accustomed to absolute authority. As we filed into the dining room, I felt Marcus squeeze my hand. "How do you feel?" he whispered. I thought about his question as I took my seat at the table, the metal still warm in my palm. How did I feel? For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the awkward outsider trying to fit into a world that didn't want her, but Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of a hero, daughter of hardworking people, a woman who had earned her place at any table through her own merit and character. "I feel," I said quietly, "like Grandpa Charlie would be proud." And as Admiral Blackwood raised his glass in a toast to family, honor, and second chances, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the same courage my grandfather had shown in that jungle 50 years ago. Because some things, love, honor, integrity, were worth fighting for no matter what the cost. 6 months later, I stood in the bridal suite of the historic Jefferson Hotel in Richmond, smoothing the skirt of my grandmother's wedding dress. The same dress Patricia had once suggested we update, with expensive alterations, had become the centerpiece of a ceremony that honored both my family's legacy and the Blackwood tradition of service. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The weeks following that explosive dinner had been filled with awkward apologies, tentative conversations, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged before they'd even had a chance to form. Amanda had been the first to reach out, appearing at my apartment 3 days after the dinner with red eyes and a box of my grandmother's favorite tea. Somehow she'd remembered me mentioning it months earlier. "I can't take back what I said," she had told me, standing nervously in my doorway. "But I want you to know that I've been thinking about it every day. About how wrong I was, how cruel I was. I let my own insecurities make me into someone I don't want to be." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and covered everything from family pressure to the burden of living up to impossible expectations. Amanda revealed that she'd spent her entire life feeling inadequate compared to the family's military achievements, never serving herself, but always being measured against standards she could never meet. "I think I resented you because you had something real," she had admitted. A grandfather who was actually a hero, not just someone who inherited a title or married into the right family. And instead of admiring that, I tried to tear you down because it made me feel better about my own shortcomings. Patricia's approach had been different, more formal but equally genuine. She had invited me to lunch at her country club, the same place where I'd endured that awful bridal shower. But this time she introduced me to every person we encountered as my future daughter-in-law Sarah, whose grandfather was awarded the Medal of Honor. The pride in her voice when she said it was unmistakable, and I began to understand that Patricia's obsession with status hadn't been about malice, it had been about fear. Fear that her family wasn't living up to their own legacy, fear that they were becoming soft and entitled, losing touch with the values that had made them worthy of respect in the first place. "Your grandfather reminded us who we're supposed to be," she had told me over lunch. "Not because of our bank accounts or our social connections, but because of our commitment to service and honor. I'm ashamed that it took his medal to make us see what should have been obvious from the beginning." Uncle Richard had surprised me most of all. The federal judge, who had once looked at me like an unwelcome intrusion, had become one of my strongest advocates. He had spent weeks researching my grandfather's service record, uncovering details even the Admiral hadn't known about subsequent missions and commendations that remained classified. "Your grandfather's file is remarkable," he had told me during a family barbecue the month before the wedding. "Even the redacted portions make it clear that he was involved in operations that shaped the course of the war. But what strikes me most is a note from his commanding officer. He said Charlie Mitchell was the kind of soldier who made everyone around him better, braver, more committed to doing the right thing." "Sounds like his granddaughter," Admiral Blackwood had said from across the patio, raising his beer in a small salute. Now, as I put the finishing touches on my makeup, I thought about how much had changed. The wedding had evolved from the small, budget-conscious ceremony Marcus and I had originally planned into something that honored both families without losing the intimate, personal feeling we had wanted. The venue was still the community center where we had first met, but it had been transformed with flowers from Patricia's garden and decorations that seamlessly blended military tradition with Kentucky mountain customs. The guest list included everyone from admirals to my cousins from the Hollers, creating a mixture that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, expecting to see Marcus's sister Jennifer, who had volunteered to be my maid of honor after Amanda had stepped aside, insisting that the role should go to someone who had supported me from the beginning. Instead, Admiral Blackwood entered, looking distinguished in his dress-white uniform. In his hands was a small wrapped package. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I wanted to give you something before the ceremony." "Of course not," I said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair beside the vanity. "What is it?" He handed me the package with a solemnity that suggested its contents were significant. Inside was a small wooden box, clearly handmade, with intricate carving that looked like military insignia. "Your grandfather made this," Admiral Blackwood said softly. "He gave it to me the day before I shipped out from Vietnam. Said it was for luck, and that I should give it to someone who needed it more than I did when the time was right." I opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in faded green felt, was a simple silver locket. When I opened it, I found a tiny photograph of a young couple, my grandparents on their wedding day. "He wanted you to have something from home to carry with you always," the Admiral explained. Even though he didn't know he would have a granddaughter yet, he somehow knew this would find its way to the right person at the right time. Tears blurred my vision as I fastened the locket around my neck. It felt like my grandfather's blessing, his presence at a moment when I needed his strength and wisdom. "Admiral," I said, "I want you to know how much it means to me that you stood up for my family, not just that night at dinner, but every day since. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied firmly. "Your grandfather saved my life, but more than that, he taught me what real courage looks like. It's not about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you are afraid. You've shown that same courage, Sarah. The way you've handled this family's prejudices, the grace you've shown in forgiving our failures. Charlie would be incredibly proud." Another knock interrupted us, and this time it was Jennifer, glowing in her pale blue bridesmaid dress. "It's time," she said with a smile. "Your groom is getting antsy, and I think Uncle Theodore is enjoying making him sweat a little." Admiral Blackwood chuckled as he stood. "A little pre-wedding anxiety builds character, but don't tell Marcus I said that." As we made our way downstairs, I could hear the string quartet playing, a mixture of classical pieces and bluegrass melodies that perfectly captured the blend of traditions we were celebrating. Through the doorway, I could see the ceremony space filled with faces both familiar and new, all united in celebration. Marcus stood at the altar in his dress-white uniform, flanked by his groomsmen, and watched over by a portrait of my grandfather in his army dress blues that had been discovered in my grandmother's attic. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, past and present, service and sacrifice, all coming together in this moment. But it was the look on Marcus's face when he saw me that made everything else fade away. The pure joy, the love, the certainty that we were exactly where we were supposed to be, surrounded by family who had learned to see beyond surface differences to the deeper truths that really mattered. As Admiral Blackwood walked me down the aisle, my father having passed away years earlier, I felt the weight of my grandfather's legacy, not as a burden but as a gift. The courage he had shown in that jungle in Vietnam had rippled forward through time, giving me the strength to stand up for myself and claim my rightful place in a family that had initially rejected me. When we reached the altar, Admiral Blackwood placed my hand in Marcus's, then stepped back with a salute, not to rank or status, but to love, honor, and the unbreakable bonds that connect one generation to the next. "Dearly beloved," the chaplain began, "we are gathered here today not just to witness the union of Marcus and Sarah, but to celebrate the coming together of two families united by service, sacrifice, and an unshakable commitment to doing what's right." As we exchanged vows, I felt my grandfather's presence as surely as if he were standing beside me. The shy girl from eastern Kentucky who had once felt so out of place in the Blackwood world had found her voice, her strength, and her home. Not because she had changed to fit their expectations, but because she had remained true to the values that had been passed down through generations of mountain strength and military honor. The reception that followed was everything I had dreamed of. Genuine laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the kind of celebration that happens when people come together, not because they have to, but because they want to honor something beautiful and true. Later that evening, as Marcus and I danced to our wedding song, I caught sight of my grandfather's Medal of Honor, now displayed prominently in the place of honor Patricia had insisted it deserved. Tomorrow, it would come home with us to start a new chapter in its journey, but tonight it served as a reminder that honor isn't inherited. It's earned, one choice at a time. "No regrets?" Marcus whispered in my ear as we swayed together. I looked around at the faces of our combined families, the Blackwoods who had learned to see beyond their prejudices, and my own relatives who had traveled from Kentucky to witness this moment. Different worlds, perhaps, but united now by something stronger than tradition or expectation. "None," I whispered back. "Your family may outrank most people, but we outrank them all in the things that really matter." And as the evening wound down with stories, laughter, and the kind of acceptance that can only come after people have seen each other at their worst and chosen to love anyway, I knew that Grandpa Charlie would have been proud. Not just of the recognition his service had finally received, but of the woman his granddaughter had become, someone who understood that true nobility isn't about where you come from, but about how you choose to live your life. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.